Hello! You might be romanticised about travelling to the past. I know a lot of people, myself included, would love to travel back to the Middle Ages, specifically medieval England. And this is what the focus of this video will be about, the issues of preparing and going around medieval England, with specific spots that I think will be of interest to see. It's difficult to summarise the Middle Ages, especially England, as there's distinctive parts of it. We have the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that make up England, then we have the Anglo-Norse England, and then finally Norman England, Plantagenet England, Tudor England, etc. But I'll be referring to each of these ages over the course of the video. As in these periods, it's not just the towns and cities that we could visit that change over the course of the Middle Ages, but also major parts of the landscape of England change greatly during the Middle Ages, which I'll go over in different parts. The topics I'll be talking about are appearing on screen now, in case you've stumbled into the Middle Ages and you're in England and you need to quickly look something up. Typically, for the Middle Ages in England, it goes early from 500 AD to 1000 AD, then high 1001 AD to 1250 AD, then late 1251 to 1500, although I date the end of the Middle Ages in England with the death of King Henry VIII. The research before going. You can't just jump into the time machine and travel back to medieval England. If I appeared wearing this outfit in medieval England, I would get a lot of bemused looks. Depending on where I am in medieval England, as the year 1450 would be completely different to say the year 950, especially in the Fens area or the Wash of England, as travelling to 950 I may land in a swamp, whereas in 1450 I could land in a drained area. So there's many factors to consider, but first and foremost is the research you'll have to do before you go. Similar to if you're going abroad to another country, you'll have to know what the culture is like, the do's and the don'ts, the language, and what diseases you'll need to protect yourself from. All of this applies to travelling back to medieval England as well. I'd highly recommend that you do some research on a variety of topics related to medieval England, as again it will make the trip easier to navigate. Behind me, or to the side of me, are some books that I would suggest you read to make the trip that much easier and to give you a good sense of what's going to happen when we go back to the Middle Ages. So to start with a classic for early medieval England, we have Asser's Life of King Alfred. This book is great as it contains the laws during King Alfred's reign, which is useful to know as the laws change over time, especially with the forest laws after the Norman conquest. It's mainly to give you a rough idea of what it might have been going on if you visit the early Middle Ages in England, or at this time Wessex, and all the other small kingdoms. The next book is The Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England. You've probably seen this one a lot, but it basically goes over a lot of aspects of late Middle Ages. So the 14th century, etc. So from buildings to towns, travel, money, basically everything I'm going to be talking about in this video, but for late Middle Ages. So it's worth a read. One other type of book that would be useful is a biography of a king. So if you're travelling back to say the early 14th century, having a biography on King Edward I would come in handy, or in any other century. There's loads of biographies on the many medieval English kings. Now, if you're a woman travelling back to the Middle Ages, I'd highly recommend these two books. As in my opinion, all women in the Middle Ages have it harder than men. So reading these books will help with the expectations and societal role depending on the class of woman. England in the 13th century. This book goes over the 13th century from the sources to the peasants, to the knights, the land, the trade, basically everything to do with the 13th century, as well as the politics. Another example book for a time period you could visit, a classic and a favourite of mine, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. If you're visiting England around 600 to 1151, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles gives a rough idea of what is going on. So Viking raids, or natural events to famines, and even the odd comet sighting. A generic book on English history, just to give some ideas on what's happening or a specific event. Going back to the early Middle Ages, we have another classic, Bede. So this goes over the really early parts of the Middle Ages. It's the only source we have for this time period, but it's well worth a read. 1215, the year of Magna Carta, another good book with many examples of what to expect in the 12th/13th century of English history, such as the countryside and towns, the church, and even some mentions of table manners for this period in English history. The medieval English economy, which can be summarised in one word, wool. So knowing what to trade for and how trade works in medieval England. Just don't go near a tanner, it's a bit smelly. Everyday life in medieval England. This book is one of the best ones to read because it goes over the lives of the ordinary people of the Middle Ages, so you can get a real sense of how people lived and acted. Anglo-Saxon food and drink. These books are great for knowing what kind of food and drink you might be able to get in Anglo-Saxon England. Table etiquette as well, calorie consumptions, sweet treats, how cheese was made and preserved, and finally, the Domesday Book, which gives us information, but not on all, the many villages, towns and holdings in Anglo-Saxon England and Norman England, and who owned them, such as Countess Godiva or Lady Godiva. So now I've gone over some of these books that you'll need to study before time travelling back to medieval England. I'm going to assume you've paused this video and have read all of those books and have come back to this video now to see the rest of it. Well done you, I'm proud of you. Now on to language. Medieval England had a variety of languages, especially in the commercial hub areas, such as London or Winchester or Bristol. Obviously, I'm speaking to you in British English, which if we went to the year 960 in Winchester, nobody would understand us. Modern English has a mixture of influences from other languages. There's the Scandinavian influences from the settlers from the Danelaw in England, and French after the Norman conquest, as William the Conqueror spoke French, and French would be the language for most of the nobility and clergy until around the start of the 116 Years' War with France. Then English starts to become more prominent due to early forms of nationalism and, of course, good old Latin for written works. But as London and Winchester were international trade areas, you'd come across many different languages. One group that always pops up in the Middle Ages, especially for England, are the Dutch, or more specifically, the Flemish. So alongside with early English, Middle English, etc., plus regional dialects of English as well as other languages. However, I believe as we've invented time travel, we would have a sophisticated translator device which is hidden, which wouldn't scare the people back then, and we would be able to communicate without any major issues. Of course, I'm not discouraging you from, if you want to learn Old English or Middle English or Old Flemish or Old French or Old Breton, etc. There's so many languages to learn in the Middle Ages. So the next obstacle are diseases and parasites, the most famous bacteria being the Black Death. So you'll need to take a bunch of vaccines, as much as your doctor would recommend. Malaria is present in England around the fens in the area of Kent, so we'll need to be aware of that. There's also tuberculosis and measles, which is highly contagious. Smallpox doesn't really come into the Middle Ages. It is present, but there's not as much cases as there are in the later centuries. Now, if you do find yourself having caught the plague, you'll have to make sure you have some antibiotics with you. Also paracetamol, just general stuff you'd keep in your own home or if you're going on holiday. So a first aid kit, antiseptic cream, bandages, etc. Just don't give out any of the medicine you have, even if you see someone ill. I'm very much suggesting you just observe. We don't want to change history, we're just here to watch, as painful as that is, especially given how high child mortality was and childbirth deaths were in the medieval world. I don't want to jump into too much details on medieval healthcare. Medieval people used ancient Greek ideas, such as the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, plus miasma theory. Remember, medieval society in England is deeply religious. Everything that happens is either the will of God or by God's graces, etc. Medieval hospitals, at least for the common people, would involve prayers for good health, or some herbal mixtures if you're lucky, whereas upper members of society could afford physicians. Medieval hospitals, in some places, there were chambers with wall paintings of saints and angels, or even Christ himself, as really only the clergy and the nobility could read. So a room filled with the many saints that you might pray to if you have a certain ailment. So a headache, you might pray to Thomas Becket. For guttache, you might pray to Saint Marasmus, etc. So you have to pray to the right saint for that ailment. So like any time period before germ theory is known, there's many diseases you can catch. But alongside that, there's stomach or GI issues, which isn't new. Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, may have suffered from Crohn's disease or inflammatory bowel disease. However, if you want to prepare your gut for the trip back, there is something you can do. So go to any pub in England, drink 6 pints of beer or ale, then after that go to the greasiest kebab shop you can find, get a kebab with all the meats, loads of sauce and red cabbage, eat all of that, and the next day you will experience GI issues just like in the Middle Ages. So I've spoken about various things which are important for time travelling back to medieval England, but now for some general advice on all the different time periods of medieval England. So early, high and late. Let's start with castles. Early Middle Ages England, there are none. Some leftover Roman forts, but not much else other than the burhs. But Anglo-Saxon England relied on burhs for defence. Fortified cities or settlements. Winchester is a classic example, but there's many others. Alfred the Great and his son, Edward the Elder, established many burhs during their reigns. Just before the Norman conquest, there may have been a few castles from Edward the Confessor's Norman supporters before they were driven out by the Godwins. But after the Norman conquest, castles were springing up like daisies. One to protect the new ruling class and to implement their military might onto the population. Most started off as wooden castles, but over the many centuries, some would turn into stone castles. The problem for yourself as a tourist, you're not going to be allowed in. These are people's homes and military bases, unless we make ourselves invisible, which again, if we've invented time travel, we might have some invisibility tech, or we disguise ourselves as someone who would be welcomed into the castle. The cool thing about English medieval history is we can kind of point towards specific time frames where major changes have happened to the landscape and buildings in England, like castles for example. My two favourites that I would love to see in their heyday are Goodrich Castle and Wallingford Castle. These castles were built and expanded over the course of Norman England. The Norman conquest of England is one major event where buildings were changed or built, as the Normans changed nearly all the churches and abbeys to suit their ideas of what they should look like. Then again with the Reformation under King Henry VIII, which destroyed many churches and abbeys. So picking the right time period is crucial if you're interested in seeing certain places. Now for castles, it's a bit different. Many castles were built and changed over the course of the Middle Ages, but their reckoning comes later during the British Civil Wars in the middle of the 17th century. Many castles were slighted so they could no longer be used as a military hub. So we have to be really specific in choosing which castle to visit due to each one's history. So we've got our medical clearance from our doctor, we've sorted out our languages, we have an idea of the time periods to visit, and hopefully we have some invisibility tech as the Middle Ages can be quite dangerous, although we'll be travelling in a group so we should be safe. And we're sticking to my loose rule of observing and not interacting unless we need to. But we should still dress appropriately for the time period, although fashion changes greatly over the course of the Middle Ages. Keep your persons light. I don't want items getting stolen, however we should be able to hide them with some invisibility tech because we've invented time travel. But also, you yourself should not try and steal or commit crimes. I'm not getting sued because you've lost your hand or hands for committing a crime. The medieval laws of England and in the wider medieval world were incredibly harsh, especially to the average person. You're not going to get thrown into prison because they don't really exist, at least in the early time period of the Middle Ages. So again, another time period specific case. In later High and Late Middle Ages, we could probably prove you were a member of upper society, then you might languish in a castle dungeon and possibly be ransomed. That's how it worked for the upper classes in medieval society, unless of course you're Duke Arthur of Brittany, who disappeared while imprisoned by his uncle King John. Money is the next item we'll need. It's a bit complicated as we're going across the Middle Ages and it's just not one time period, but again, I'll give some examples as there's many different coins throughout Middle Ages England. We've got the penny, the halfpenny, the short cross penny, all in silver, but then in the later Middle Ages, new coins come in. Some with gold in them are created and are in circulation. And then there's the units, shillings, pounds and marks. And like everything else, coinage changes over the course of the Middle Ages. From the coinage reforms during the reign of King Edgar in the early Middle Ages, the new types of coins issued during the reign of King Edward III, the influx of silver into England during the early 13th century being one of the major increases in inflation. So having plenty of silver coins or pennies in different ways, like the halfpenny, is going to be helpful if we're going shopping or paying tolls or paying rent, etc. England's pennies were well known for their high silver content. The National Archives have a currency converter so you can see the buying power you'd have from 1270 onwards, so it's useful for seeing how far the money you have is going to go in that time period. One particular problem we have is acquiring these coins. We don't have as many coins that would be in circulation in the Middle Ages as we do now, as most coins would be in museums, rightfully so, or in private collector hands. So if you're a collector of coins from the reign of King Edward, for example, fine, no problem, but most aren't going to be. So we might have to take back some goods we could sell, for example copper pots or farming tools, or cattle if we can fit them in the time machine. It's something we'll need to plan out. One final currency that a lot of people in the Middle Ages used in England especially were eels. Eels were everywhere in England. They were just so abundant and many places used eels to pay their rents. Now we've got to decide where to sleep. Looking at the best map of medieval Britain from the Middle Ages, this one by Matthew Paris, it's not really going to help us out. But again, where we can stay depends on what time period we're in. But as nearly most people in Middle Ages England lived in rural locations or a small village, we might struggle to find somewhere to stay unless we can make friends with some local medieval people and they invite us into their homes. Nearly everyone in the Middle Ages is going to be house proud. They'll want to show off their hospitality to you. Camping is too dangerous, one for bandits or wild animals. England in the Middle Ages had boars and wolves, so it's not a viable option. Plus, I hate camping. I really do. And as I'm the tour guide, we're going to abide by what I say. And we need to be aware of the forest laws which come into effect after the Norman conquest. One location that would be fantastic to spend the night in would be a monastery or an abbey. Hospitals not so much, as they're mainly for the poor and in some cases the sick. We don't want to share beds. It varies from place to place, plus there's also the issue of social standing, which will affect what kind of reception we would receive. So there's many different classes in medieval English society, all throughout the Middle Ages. Peasants, knights, monks, abbots, bishops, all of these held positions in a hierarchy in medieval society, and some change, for example, reeves, ealdormans, earls, so it's just pick your class for what you want to experience. So if we're wandering around a city, say London, in 1236, and we're dressed in rich, colourful clothing, we're probably going to get some attention, whereas if we were dressed as a peasant who probably can't quite afford such rich, colourful clothing. It seems simple, but with everything else we have to consider so many options before we go. If we are in a city, say London for example, there's going to be plenty of inns to stay at if we need to. We're not going to know off the top of our heads what kind of rating these inns have, as there's no TripAdvisor or Google reviews. So I'll make some contacts in time so we can stay in private residences. So now we've sorted out our places to stay, let's move on to food and dietary requirements. First thing is seasonal food. I know we're used to having whatever food we want whenever we want it, but it's the same for all centuries up until the 20th century, so not just the Middle Ages. Certain foods are going to be available or unavailable depending on the time of year. So fruits and vegetables, meat is going to be expensive. A lot of animals we consume in our time period aren't as big in the medieval world, so cows and sheep and certain breeds of cattle don't exist. And the upper members of society really enjoyed eating a variety of birds, such as herons, swans, peacocks, etc. The major problem we're going to have is everyone's dietary requirements. For example, I don't eat beef or pork, nor bread, which is the staple food of medieval England. I also try to have at least 100 grams of protein a day, but we'd be okay if you're a vegetarian. Plus there's location to consider. If we're by the coast, by Sandwich or Berwick for example, we'd have easier access to fresh fish such as salmon, herring, cod, etc. As I mentioned that medieval people were deeply religious, we'll have to abide by certain feast days. From the Open Doomsday Project, many freshwater and coastal fisheries are mentioned in Doomsday, though not all counties record them. Tax was commonly paid in fish, eels, salmon and herring are the most often recorded types. Fish was an essential element in the medieval diet, especially as the church forbade the eating of meat during the 6 weeks of Lent, on Fridays and Saturdays throughout the year, and on important festivals. I like fish quite a bit, so I'm okay with this. Quickly going back to bread, which was made with a variety of grains, and to quote from one of the books I mentioned at the start of the video, Anglo-Saxon Food, enriched loaves could have been kneaded with milk instead of water or cream and had eggs, butter and other fats incorporated into the dough. They may have been sweetened with honey or contain fruits preserved in honey or dried. Some foods we can obtain are going to cost quite a lot more than other foods, due to its rarity and the fact that it has to be imported. Fruits such as lemons, oranges, pomegranates, etc. Almonds is another popular expensive food, and again, social class comes into food as well. If we're dining with a bishop or a noble, we're going to have access to a lot of rich food and a lot of it. Giving your guests rich, expensive foods and lots of it is one way in which many rich people in medieval society flexed their wealth. If you're interested in what the highest members of medieval society were eating in England, I have a video all about the medieval King of England's favourite foods. As for dining out on the go, there's a few options available to us. If we're staying at someone's house or manor, the hospitality is going to be the best the homeowner can provide, with the best food that they have. As I said, medieval people were very house proud, and providing good hospitality is godly. But again, it depends on your social rank. If we're utterly destitute, then almshouses would give out food, mainly bread. But if we're travelling around, say, Winchester or Bristol, any inn we might stay at sells food, and there'll be vendors selling food on the streets, especially on market day. Some might offer the option for a sit-down meal, like a stew for example. Or if we're on the go, then there's pies and pastries or salted meat. Spices such as saffron and ginger are going to cost quite a lot more than most other foods because they have to be imported and it depends how far they've come. And we will have to be careful about local or regional famines. Unfortunately for me and you, there are no fish and chip shops. Despite it being a classic English dish, potatoes have not been discovered in the Middle Ages, which is a shame as I love potatoes. And we don't want to introduce potatoes to medieval England as it would change history due to potatoes being such a staple food. One other quick thing in terms of dining, the rules change over the Middle Ages, so we'll need to prepare on how to act while dining for each part in the Middle Ages. It's the same with social class, we need to pick one because the experience will differ in the Middle Ages, as there's different ways of interacting with people based on their social class and cues. There'll be a range to choose from before we travel back, with details and specifics alongside user ratings. So that's food sorted, now on to drink. Medieval England had a variety of different drinks, ale being a very popular one, alongside wine, milk, cider, and of course water. Ale and wine come in a variety of different qualities. French wine is normally what the upper members of English society would drink. There is English wine, but the quality varies depending on the location. The same with ale as well. Many people brewed ale, but to sell it you needed a license. So if you fancy some ale, please make sure the seller has a license before you buy it. I don't want you getting ill because you've drank bad ale. Milk is going to be raw, which isn't good. There might be some nasty bacteria in there, which might make us rather ill, so hopefully we can take something that's discreet, that pasteurizes the milk, or we simply avoid it. The same applies to water, which is the most annoying myth of the Middle Ages, that people in the medieval period avoided water. That isn't the case. This quote from Bede in the 8th century is one point about water. Established a benefit for his people in that in many places where clear springs/streams ran by well-used roads, where they were most frequented, he ordered posts with bronze cups hung on them to be set up for the refreshment of travellers. So water was used on an everyday basis for cooking and cleaning and as well as drinking. Some monasteries in England had an interesting water system where water would be taken from a lake or a river and diverted into various pools, and that water would be used for various uses. In some places today you can still see them. Like I said earlier, I'd love to see the Great Conduit in London. Now I'm assuming you've watched Pre-Modernist's video on advice for time travelling to medieval Europe, which he has a chapter called What If You're Not White, which to heavily summarise, medieval ideas of race are not the same as they were in the 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st century. As long as you were Christian, you were fine. Now for medieval England, it's a little bit different. Mainly if you're Welsh or Irish, you're going to have a tougher time in England, Wales particularly after the conquest of Wales by King Edward I of England. One example is English laws being used to replace or override Welsh laws. New towns that were settled by people from England meant that Welshmen could not own land around some areas of these new towns. The Welsh could only enter these new towns on market days, and in some cases the Welsh were pushed away from the land they were living on to make way for new English settlers. Alongside that, some medieval chroniclers disparaged the Welsh. The same thing happens to Ireland as well. Ironically, one chronicler called the Irish barbarous people, and that the Irish are a rude people subsisting on the produce of their cattle only, and they themselves living like beasts. That chronicler was Gerald of Wales, from his topography of Ireland in the late 12th century. Picking a location, Arguably, this is going to be the hardest choice we're going to face, as it's very time period dependent. Most people in medieval England lived in rural locations due to the economy being majority agricultural. The population never reached over 6 million in the entirety of the Middle Ages due to various factors. London being the biggest in the High and later Middle Ages, with its population at its height being possibly just under 100,000 people, and certain towns and cities are created and developed over the Middle Ages. So take Liverpool for example. There's no Liverpool until the early 13th century, and it's the same with many other places. But then there's sites which do exist, but are time period dependent. Southampton, for example, its great medieval walls were built during the reign of King Edward III, but its founding as a burh in the early Middle Ages would be of interest to see as well. So let me suggest some sites to visit for early, high and late Middle Ages. So the first location for early is Glastonbury Abbey, as it was the burial site for a few Anglo-Saxon kings of England, so I'd like to see the abbey before the Normans remodelled it. The same with the new minster at Winchester. Again, after the Norman conquest, Winchester Cathedral was built on the site where the new minster was. King Alfred and Edward the Elder were buried there. And third and final for early, Danelaw, York. I'd like to see how York looked in the early 10th century. Now for high, Dover Castle under the reign of King Henry II. I'd like to see the work going on there. Goodrich Castle, which is my personal favourite castle, and Wallingford Castle. This castle was one of the most impressively defensive in England, surviving multiple sieges during its height. Again, it's another castle that was slighted during the British Civil Wars, so I would like to see it in its full defensive capabilities. Now for late Middle Ages London, there would be so much to see. Old St Paul's Cathedral would be one sight to see, the original London Bridge, and for me, because I find water management and water infrastructure in the Middle Ages interesting, I would like to see the Great Conduit, which to summarise was a network of pipes feeding from a reservoir in and around London, bringing in fresh water to the people. It was destroyed during the Great Fire of London in 1666. Another location would be Sheen Palace before it was changed into Richmond Palace. Sheen was one of Richard II's favourite locations, as it had bronze taps to bring in hot and cold water. The final location for late medieval England, my hometown of Worcester. I'd love to see what it looked like in the Middle Ages, as Worcester might be the unluckiest city in England due to its suffering in the civil wars. Obviously there's loads of choices we can pick from. Again, make sure to look at the Doomsday Book for information on certain places. However, just also bear in mind that travelling around medieval England is going to be rather slow, especially if we don't have horses. Medieval England, especially in the early and high parts, the roads used were mainly old Roman roads because they worked so well, although depending on the location, they may have fallen into disrepair. So again, to sound like a broken record, it's time period dependent. Bridges were being built during the Middle Ages and, similar to castles, started off wooden, then in the later medieval period were changed to stone. The importance of this also comes from the Magna Carta, clause 23. No town or person shall be forced to build bridges over rivers, except those with an ancient obligation to do so. So our journey around England could take a while is the main point I want to make, and there might be traffic jams depending on if we bump into the King's baggage train. Most of the medieval kings of England travelled around England extensively, and their household would travel with them with dozens of carts. So I've given you some ideas of where we could go and what we could see. Now let's look at the time periods in medieval England to avoid. So the first thing is the Black Death. For England, it's the year 1349. That's the height of the plague outbreak. And then again in the early 1360s, However, the plague has sporadic outbreaks afterwards. So we just need to know about the area we're going to visit, as the death counts were insanely horrible. It would be awful to go back to this point in time. The next one is 1315 to 1317. This short period is known as the Great Famine. As I mentioned, medieval England is an agricultural society, so if the crops fail, this leads to a domino effect, and that's exactly what happened. Crops failed due to bad weather, so the different grains couldn't be harvested. The heavy rains also affected salt production needed for preserving food, which England has plenty of salt production places, such as Droitwich, that's also impacted. It was just so difficult to get the staple food of medieval England, bread, plus the price of food skyrocketing. So we just need to be aware of any local famines when we go, plus regional foods, similar to today. It's probably how we got the whole debate on which goes on first, on a scone, jam or cream then jam. I'm personally fine with any combination of jam or cream. So I realise I'm picking on the late Middle Ages with these examples, so let's go for some early Middle Ages examples. The height of the Viking attacks in England during the reign of King Ethelred the Unready, 980 to 1014. Plus the Viking conquest of England by King Canute in 1016. There was so much death and destruction from Canute's conquest. If you read the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, you'll know just how bad it gets. Also, the invasion of the Great Heathen Army in 865 till around 878, and again sporadic attacks afterwards. In England, the end of the Viking Age is considered around 1066, with the death of Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. But it's not really true. Attacks from Scandinavia continued well until William the Conqueror's reign, but people like convenient ends for explanations. So, going back to a plague for the early Middle Ages, we have the Plague of Justinian, which dates from 541 to 550, so we're at the near start of the Middle Ages. So England, which doesn't exist at this time, but we have the long migration of Germanic peoples coming into Britain, which would eventually form the Anglo-Saxon or early English kingdoms. The problem is we don't have a lot of information on the effects of this plague due to a lack of sources. The Welsh annals mention the plague, but not much else on the Briton kingdoms, so we will avoid this time frame. Moving into the High Middle Ages, there's 1066, not a great year to be in England, with two major invasions, with one being successful, with the Normans. Then I wouldn't want to be in the north of England during the harrying of the north from 1069 to 1070. William the Conqueror and his forces just decimate areas, mainly around Yorkshire, looting and slaughtering. It's way too dangerous to visit. Again, the Domesday Book gives us a horrible picture of just how devastating the harrying was. One final time period from the High Middle Ages. This period is known as the Anarchy. Just a quick summary, from 1138 to 1153, England was in a civil war between Empress Matilda, the last surviving legitimate child of King Henry I of England, versus King Stephen, Matilda's cousin, who took the throne after Henry's death. Quite a few places were sacked during the civil war. Worcester, Oxford, Nottingham, Winchester. The nobles of England were just building castles without permission, so it's just not a great time to be in the southwest of England, where most of the fighting took place. And finally, to go back to the late Middle Ages, the Wars of the Roses saw a lot of battles, so we would just have to avoid them. I'd hate to be in the town of Tewkesbury during that battle. As for the 116-year war with France, most of that fighting took place in France. Only a few attacks on England by the French occurred, for example in Southampton in 1338. But then we have to consider England's neighbours, the Welsh and the Scots, especially the Scots, as they raided England in various points during the Middle Ages. One example is Hereford in late 1054. The Welsh attacked the city. Then, to the Scots, they and the English had a nasty habit of raiding each other over the course of the Middle Ages, the high points being during the reign of King Malcolm III in the late 11th century. One other example is during the Scottish War of Independence, the first one, especially after the Scots' victory at Bannockburn in 1314. The Scots were raiding the north of England with impunity. So we need to be really specific and detailed on what year, month and day we're picking to visit medieval England. We don't want to arrive in the middle of the Battle of Hastings. But now let's look at some time periods to visit where we might be a bit safer, starting with the early Middle Ages. The years of 959 to 975. These years are during the reign of one of the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kings of England, King Edgar. His reign is known for that there were no recorded Viking attacks on England, a lot of monastic reforms, and that nearly all the kings within Britain submitted to Edgar. His coronation at Bath would be a sight to see, as famously Edgar was rowed across the River Dee by several kings. The next time frame is the last 10 years of King Edward the Confessor's reign, from 1056 just stopping before 1066. It's in my opinion that by 1056 King Edward had resigned to his fate and just allowed the Godwins to run England while he chilled. And I would like to see Westminster Abbey being built. Alongside that, late Anglo-Saxon England would be an interesting period to see. The last 20 years of King Henry I's reign, from 1115 to 1135. England is pretty secure at this point. The majority of the fighting that takes place during King Henry's reign happens in France in Henry's French territories. England and Scotland's relations are probably at their highest in this time period of the Middle Ages, as the King of Scots had spent a bit of time in Henry's court, especially King David, one of Scotland's best kings. And it would be nice to see Reading Abbey. That's one location that's a highlight of this time period. Now, one area of English history that would be a personal favourite of mine to visit would be the reign of the greatest English medieval king, Henry II. England is great to visit during his reign, as long as we avoid Canterbury on the 20th of December 1170, and the years of 1173 to 1174 due to the Great Revolt against Henry. But other than that, it's a cool time to visit medieval England. We could see Woodstock Palace or sneak into Dover Castle using cloaking devices, because we've invented time travel. Now, to end this chapter with some quick fire time periods. The middle of Henry III's reign. This is a good transition period where stone structures are becoming more commonplace, including Henry's Royal Loo at Clifford Tower or Guildford Castle. The second reign of King Edward IV. Late medieval England under his reign would be interesting to see. The Great Hall at Eltham Palace, or Edward's work on St George's Chapel in Windsor, which was another casualty of the British Civil Wars. Again, there's so much to see, you'd really have to pick a number of sites to visit. Now I'll explain some fun things we can do in medieval England. So if we really wanted to blend in, then visiting a few pilgrim shrines is a good way to go. So in English history, nearly all the saint shrines get destroyed during the Reformation. One of the most popular pilgrim sites was the Shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury. It was right at the back of the cathedral, but in our time, the site is marked with a candle and a plaque. You could buy some saint relics. I say relics, they were really just fake items to sell to pilgrims, but it would be funny to see the bones you could buy. Or you could collect some pilgrim badges that would give you some credit in the medieval world, showing you as a devout pilgrim. Jousting, the classic theme of the Middle Ages in the high and late period, or a melee. Then some shopping, seeing all the goods you could buy from around medieval Europe and beyond, such items as silk, garments of various colour, perfumes and ornaments, glasswork, etc. There's so much to buy and see. Hunting was incredibly popular in the Middle Ages, but it's unethical and incredibly dangerous, so I would not suggest doing it, and it was a hobby for the rich. The kings loved hunting. It might be worth learning some medieval dance moves before we go, as they were popular, alongside singing, music and plays. Hawking is rather expensive, and the bird you would own is connected to your social class. But you could have a crack at archery, and you might be so good at it, you might be invited to fight against the French. We could go gambling as well, but that's probably not a good idea in case we get swindled or we lose heavily. The thing is, there's so much to do and see in medieval England, we're going to be spoilt for choice. Now for our final chapter, medieval England in our time. So luckily, if we wanted to experience medieval England, we can. There's many events that go on over the year that showcase medieval life. The numerous medieval festivals that go on in the UK, where reenactors showcase the clothing, food, production, etc. of medieval life, but with health and safety. There's tons of medieval sites around. For example, here's Odder's Chapel, an Anglo-Saxon building from the late 10th century, or a 14th century coaching house that is now a pub. Or if you wanted to experience medieval life, you could visit Butsey Ancient Farm or Cosmeston Medieval Village in Wales. And there's still a lot of churches and cathedrals that still have many of their medieval aspects, and with most actively promoting them to tourists. And given how this video is received, I might make a reoccurring series called A Medievalist Guide to a Certain Town or City in the UK, where I showcase the medieval buildings and events on whichever town or city I'm filming in. Anyway, thank you all for watching. A big thank you to Premodernist for allowing me to reference his video, Advice for Time Travelling to Medieval Europe. That video inspired this one. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to do all the usual stuff, liking, sharing, hyping, etc. And if you want to support the channel, you can via Patreon or YouTube channel membership. I've been making more bonus videos so you can watch as a member. So thank you all again, and I will see you later. Cheers.